Hi, good afternoon everyone. Good afternoon po, Sir Rizal. We are the group 4 and we are going to tackle the three periods of American literature. Um, the three periods of American literature which are the colonial period of 1607 to 1776, revolutionary period and early national period, and romantic period. Okay. For a sort of introduction, colonial period is all about the arrival of Englishmen to the Declaration of Independence. And then the next period, which is the revolutionary period, is all about the clash between colonies and beliefs. And then the last period, which is the romantic period, is mysticism and transcendentalism, and it is more on the sequences on revolutionary period. However, we are not going further to the last two periods. Let us now proceed first to the 17th century or the colonial period, which is the period between 1607 to 1776. Concepts in colonial period or the 17th century is the name of John Smith, who started American literature, believes to started American literature, the Puritan colonization of New England, the earliest American literature, and the characteristic of American literature during this period, and the Declaration of Independence during 1776. In 1607, the first permanent English colony within the present limits of the United States was planted at Jamestown in Virginia. This was the start of the colonial period in American literature. This history of American literature begins with the arrival of English-speaking Europeans in what would become the United States. At first, American literature was naturally a colonial literature by authors who were Englishmen and who thought and wrote as such. Just for the record, John Smith, the second important concept in this key points in 17th century is a soldier of fortune. He is credited with initiating American literature. His chief books included A True Relation of Virginia and The General History of Virginia, New England, and the Summer of Isle. Not going further from that, the Puritan colonization of New England took place in a comparatively brief space of time, during the 20 years from 1620 to 1640, when persecution drove the Puritans to New England in multitudes. But in that year, they suddenly stopped coming. According to my research, for more than 100 years after the Pilgrim landing in 1620, life and writing in New England were dominated by the religious attitude known as Puritanism. Well, as you know, to understand colonial life and literature, one must and should understand Puritanism, the concept of Puritanism. One of the major influences because it is one of the major influences in American life. The early settlers in New England were Protestants. England had become a Protestant country when Henry VIII broke away from the Roman Catholic Church. Some Englishmen, however, felt that the break was not complete. They wanted to purify the Church of Catholic features. That's why, or therefore, they are known as Puritans from its root word to purify. Okay, I believe other groups have mentioned that also. Anyway, in its earliest days, American literature consisted mostly of practical nonfiction written by British settlers who populated the colonies that would become the United States. A new era began when the United States declared its independence during or in 1776, and much new writing addressed the country's future. American poetry and fiction were largely molded on what was being published overseas in Great Britain, and much of what American readers consumed also came from Great Britain. Anyway, for more deeper discussion, may I call on my group mate, Mr. Ariel Papakpak.
Okay, thank you, Miss Ayesa. I am Ariel Mabakpak, and this is my part, the discussion about the colonial period that happened on 1607 and 1607 to 1776. So let's start. In 1607, the first permanent English colony within the present limits of the United States was planted at Jamestown in Virginia. So in 1607, 104 Englishmen and boys arrived in North America to start a settlement. On May 13th, they picked Jamestown, Virginia for their settlement, which was named after their King James I. The settlement became the first permanent English settlement in North America. The site for Jamestown was picked for several reasons, all of which met criteria the Virginia company who funded the settlement said to follow in picking a spot for the settlement. The site was surrounded by water on three sides, and was far inland. Both meant it was easily defensible against possible Spanish attacks. The water was also deep enough that the English could tie their ships at the shoreline. The site was also not inhabited by the native population. And during the period from 1620 to 1640, large numbers of English people migrated to that part of America now known as New England. So the English people that are being referred here is called Puritans. So what's Puritans? So they came to explore, to make money, spread, and to practice their religion freely and to live on land of their own. And in September of 1620, these people traveled to the New World on a rented cargo ship. Sorry for the interruption. In September of 1620, these people traveled to the New World on a rented cargo ship called the Mayflower and landed off the coast of Massachusetts in November, where they established Plymouth Colony, the first colony in New England. This event marks the beginning of the Great Puritan Migration. And the first Puritan colonists who settled New England exemplified the seriousness of Reformation Christianity, known as the Pilgrims. So what is Reformation Christianity? The key ideas of the Reformation is it's a call to purify the church and a belief that the Bible should be the sole source of spiritual authority. And the first group of Puritans to make their way across the Atlantic was a small contingent known as the Pilgrim. Unlike other Puritans, they insisted on a complete separation from the Church of England and had first migrated to the Dutch Republic seeking religious freedom. And however, the Puritan colonization of New England took place in a comparatively brief space of time during 20 years from 1620 to 1640, when persecution drove the Puritans to New England in multitudes. But in that year, they suddenly stopped coming. So it says here that the Puritan colonization of New England only lasted for 20 years, and they have decided to leave England primarily due to religious persecution, but also for economic reasons as well. England was in religious turmoil in the early 17th century. The religious climate was hostile and threatening, especially towards religious nonconformists like the Puritans. Virginia and New England developed along different lines, so the Virginia and New England have different land rules. The New England colonies grew by a process of group settlement. The general courts of the various colonies, most notably that of Massachusetts Bay, would make a grant of land to a migrating group, fixing its boundaries carefully. This group would then establish a new town. Its common lands, fencing, grazing practices, and the mode of apportionment of farms were regulated by general court or legislature. But each town then took control of land allotments and management. The legislature determined who should be admitted to the town as settlers and freeholders. The town meetings or boards of town proprietors laid out the land of each settlement as house lots, common fields, meadow, and pasture, and ultimately divided it among owners. Inhabitants of each town commonly dwelt together for society and protection and traveled from the town center to till their acres. The typical town was thus closely akin to an English manor, but with no lord of the manor instead. The town was, of course, the church center and its pastor was the community leader. Military service, elections, and taxation were based on the town. While in New England, there were more dwellers in towns, more democracy and mingling of all classes, more popular education and more literature, while in Virginia, a wealthy class of landed gentry came to be an increasing power in the political history of the country. The Puritans had fought the Stuart kings and had approved a commonwealth. So the kings were James IV and Charles I, and under Charles I, the Puritans became a political force as well as a religious tendency in the country. Opponents of the royal prerogative became allies of Puritan reformers who saw the Church of England moving in a direction opposite to what they wanted and objected to increased Catholic influence both at court and within the church. Many of the royalists came to Virginia to escape oppressive Puritan rule. So what is royalist first? It's an adherent of royalism, person who supports a monarch or a monarchy, especially in times of revolution and civil war. So consequently, Virginia became a beacon of safety, camaraderie, and opportunity or safe space. As England lurched toward civil war and the Puritan Commonwealth, the colony of Virginia became a refuge for royalists loyal to the Stuart monarchy. Through the middle decades of the 17th century, aristocrats and adventurers sought a new life in a new world. So this is the hero of the Jamestown colony and its savior during the first 2 years, and he is a Captain John Smith. So who is John Smith first? So John Smith was an English soldier, explorer, colonial governor, admiral of New England, and an author. He played an important role in the establishment of the colony at Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in America, in the early 17th century, and soon became the president of the Jamestown colony and labored strenuously for its preservation. The first product of his pen in America was A True Relation of Virginia, written in 1608. And the last work written by Smith in America is entitled A Map of Virginia. So that's the end of my partial report. May I call on Jemina for her part?
Hello everyone. So let's now proceed with the related literature from the colonial period, which is Pocahontas. So if you have watched the movie Pocahontas, this is a true form. This is her true form, an 11-year-old girl, different from the Disney movie. So now I will just summarize the short story of the essential discretion. So the story starts when the Englishmen settled in Powhatan in search for economic opportunity, but the tribe is not friendly, and the chief of Powhatan, Wakomoko, did not want to meet the English until winter. So the brother of Pocahontas, Openconcanov, who is hostile towards the English, captured Smith and brought him to several Indian towns to boast about capturing James and proceed to Powhatan. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So when James Smith was brought to the town of Powhatan, the chief decided to execute James by smashing his head. But then, before the killing happened, Pocahontas interfered. Through the talking of James and the chief of Powhatan, they did the negotiation, and Powhatan would give Kapahawasik and forever esteem him as his son, not unquote. That means the chief of Powhatan Werowocomoco acknowledged James Smith. Then James was then allowed to leave. Once James Smith returned to Jamestown, Chief of Powhatan sent gifts of food to starving English, escorted by Pocahontas as she is a sign of peace. So Pocahontas, the very important daughter of the chief, was sent to negotiate to release of the Powhatan prisoners. And according to James Smith, it was all because of Pocahontas that he released the prisoners. So the Powhatan agents and English began to deteriorate, but Pocahontas' relationship with the newcomers was not over. Next slide, please. The English visited the tribe to trade beads and other trinkets for more corn, but a severe drought had reduced the tribe's harvest. And then a policy was made, which is to cease trading with the English because of the needs of the Powhatan tribe. However, the settlers were too demanding and began to threaten the tribe and burn down towns to get supplies. The chief of Powhatan sends a message to James Smith telling him if he brought to Werowocomoco a swords, guns, and hens, coppers, and other trade things, he would give Smith ship loaded with corn. In that time, Powhatan chief planned to kill James Smith in the negotiation. But then, before the killing happened, James Smith was warned by Pocahontas. Hence, the execution did not happen. Although James noticed that something was wrong, he was still thankful to Pocahontas for saving his life again. And after that, Powhatan excused himself and his family departed in the woods. Afterwards, the two did not meet. So, as relations between the two deteriorated, the chief of Powhatan moved his capital to Werowocomoco on the York River in 1600s to Orapax. And then after that, Pocahontas visited London later, and their story was actually said or by James Smith, and that's it. The um, the next reporter will be Miss Alia Pamplona.
So now we will go to the topic. The first slide. New England started a printing press and was printing books by 1640 began. And then American literature begins with the orally transmitted myths, legends, tales, and lyrics. And then Native American oral literature is quite diverse. Oral tradition is a series of stories passed down from generation to generation. Also, the stories of northern lakeside dwellers differ from radically stories of desert tribes. Next slide. Next slide. So here, Benjamin Franklin's first published in 1732. It was the most famous at this time. And then almanacs were as a popular as the Bible. And then children enjoyed those stories, whether forecasts, poetry, news, events, and advice, and other random useful and information. So the almanacs was very popular in that era. Next slide, please. Okay, here there were many different Native American tribes, but there were a few elements that many of Native American stories have in common. The first one is a hero's journey, which is it talks about the story that deals with a hero who goes through a series of hardship. And then the second is a trickster God interferes. It talks about a mess, a mess with humans and cause of havoc. And then second is nature changes. Nature becomes a symbol of what the hero is going through. Then the fourth is worlds are created. Through this, it became the key element of many Native American stories. Next slide, please. And then here, we can see the example of oral genre in American Indian Lit. Those are lyrics, chants, myths, fairy tales, humorous anecdotes, incantation, riddles, proverbs, epics, and legendary histories. Next slide. Okay. Next slide is about the Puritans. The Puritans chose the Bible as the guidebook of their promised land. The long sermons to which they have listened were chiefly biblical expositions, and the Bible took the place of secular poetry and prose. The Puritans dominated the colonial literary scene in America, and their theology and the hard conditions of life did not encourage the production of poetry. Next slide, please. Okay, um, there are three major categories of literature from 17th and 18th century. Native American, which are the Native American oral stories, Puritans writings, and the third is early American political writings. So next slide. So we will discuss further the Native American oral stories. It is about preserves cultural legacy and tradition through storytelling, oratory, and performance. Also, it known for its to rich oral tradition. Instead of using a written language to document their story, these indigenous people simply relied on their verbal language to share their history, customs, rituals, and their legends through vivid narratives or storytelling. The next slide. The second is about Puritan writing. It is characterized by a simplicity of form. It avoids the complex syntax and verbiage of paper or of direct clear speech. Next slide. So here, early American political writings. These volumes provide a selection of 76 essays, including including the pamphlets, speeches, and letters to newspaper. It was written between 1760 and 1805 by American political and religious leaders. Next slide. Okay, now let's discuss about the 10 genres of literature in this period. The first one is the travel writing. It is about the written by the explorer about their experience upon their exploration. And then the next slide. Second is historical writing. It, it is about the historians have written in every age since Hebrews wrote the Old Testament. The third is religious writing. It's usually written by clergy in a form of journals. Also, the sermons or commentaries on the Bible and religious experience. It says the verses, and the biblical educational that we can apply into our life. And then next slide. Okay. The fourth is the philosophy. It is the genre that ranges from pure metaphysical speculation and to early sociology and also to transcendentalism. And then the fifth is natural writings. It is the writings wherein it about course that introduces students to different type of scientific writing and research such as the thesis. And then next slide. Okay. It the sixth is the newspaper journalism and political essay writing. This genre aims to provide reporters with the information to formulate their own opinion and idea in that so they can participate in their community because they have the knowledge of what what is going on their surroundings. Next slide. Okay, the seven is about poetry. It is about the imaginative awareness of experience or specific emotional response elicited by language chosen and arranged for its meaning and sound and rhythm. So in poetry, the writers express their own experience, even it is into reality or in imagination. So in poetry, it is a form of their expression. Next slide. The eighth is the drama, which is it is about to explore the mechanism of dramatic storytelling. So we are aware of this. Next slide. Okay, the humor. Humor is amusing, especially in a clever or witty way. It is a style of comedy that makes light of subject matter that is generally considered taboo, particularly subjects that are normally considered serious or painful to discuss. Writers and comedians often use it as a tool for exploring vulgar issues by provoking discomfort, serious thought, and also for amusement for the audience. And then the third is fiction. Through this, it is a form of genre or writings that includes the imaginative um, or the creativity ideas of the writers. It is about the not or it is about the fantasy or imaginative or imagination of the writers. So next slide. So this slide will going to discuss by Miss Okendo.
Thank you. So now let's move on with the subgenre of narrative prose under study, and this is almanac. Uh, Almanac is a book or table containing a calendar of the days, weeks, and months of the year. Somehow it is the almanac is yeah. In Almanac, we can also see the climate information and seasonal suggestions for farmers and other miscellaneous data. Furthermore, Almanac provides the data on the rising and the setting times of the sun and the moon, such as the phases of the moon, the positions of the planets, and the schedules of high and low tides. In Almanac, It is a climate information and seasonal suggestion for farmers. Next, please. In modern Arabic, almanac is the word for climate. So, the first printed almanac appeared in Europe in 1457, but almanac existed in some form since the beginnings of astronomy. Almanacs began to gain real prominence only after the development of printing. These early printed almanacs devoted as much space to astrology and prophecies and predictions of the future as they did to basic calendarical and astronomical data. This was the first almanac of James, and it is not only giving facts about weather or astronomy, but it also provides moral precepts, medical advices, and remedies, jokes, and even fiction. And that is the Rhode Island Almanac in 1728. Benjamin Franklin began his Poor Richard's Almanac. This is the most famous of American almanacs in Philadelphia in 1732. With that, Benjamin Franklin started his own almanac entitled, the Poor Richard's Almanac. With that, let us know the life of Benjamin Franklin that will be further discussed by Miss Alisa or Ariel Mapakpak.
Thank you, Miss Janina. So, unfortunately, Miss Oliver cannot attend the report today because of emergency. So, I will take the responsibility. But I'm just going to read her report. Selections from the colonial period. Poor Richard's Almanac by Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was one of the founding fathers of the United States. He was a gifted author, printer, politician, scientist, inventor, statesman, and a diplomat. When Benjamin Franklin was only 12, he became a printing apprentice. Please, next slide. Revolutionary period happened on 1765 to 1790, and early national period 1775 to 1828. So for deeper explanation, let's hear it from Miss Ayasa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Papakpak. Okay, let us now proceed with the Revolutionary period and early national period. Okay, as I have said earlier, this period mainly talks about the clash between colonists and Philippines. How so? Okay, the time period of revolutionary and early national period is between 1765 to 1790 and 1775 to 1828. The important concepts of this period are the American and 18th century or revolutionary or early national period, the anti-federalist, the Constitution and Bill of Rights, the Enlightenment, and the Age of Reason. For some sort of introduction, the American 18th century, often called as the revolutionary or early national period, by the way, it was called revolutionary period because it was coincided with the establishment of the soon-to-be United States. Okay, as I mentioned, revolutionary or early national period was one punctuated by warfare and nation building. The fight between the colonies was another extension of the historic enmity between France and England, and was also mirrored by enmities between different Native American tribes who allied themselves to the side which best served their interests and desired to defeat rival tribes. The North American phase of the war concluded in 1760. The larger conflict was not settled until 1763. American colonies. American colonists' participation in the French and Indian War affected the American Revolution. Okay. American resentment of and resistance to England. Okay, I'm so sorry for that. Again, American colonists' participation in the French and Indian War affected the American Revolution. American resentment of and resistance to England peaked with the Intolerable Act of 1774. In response, all the colonies except Georgia convened the First Continental Congress and sent a Declaration of Rights and Grievances to England in late 1774. That was the Anti-Federalist, the Constitution and Bill of Rights. Okay. England's reply was to send troops to put down colonial resistance. And the battles of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775 initiated the American Revolutionary War. Okay, let us now proceed with the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was the major cultural influence on 18th century of America. And through it, the early colonial worldview, dominated by Puritan theology, shifted into a worldview influenced by science and philosophy. There was an explosion of improved scientific technologies during that 17th century. The existence of laws asserted that the universe was ordered on a rational principles that man could understand using reason. In short, this became full of parang reasoning era, ganun. Though science and philosophy had increased influence on 18th century American culture, religion had not vanished from the scene. Because according to my research, in America, in the early years of the 18th century, some writers, such as Cotton Mather, carried on the older tradition. There are still some writers who still carried on the older tradition. His huge history and biography of Puritan New England, Magnalia Christi Americana in 1702, and his vigorous Mandaktio and Ministerium or Introduction to the Ministry in 1726 were defenses of ancient Puritan conviction. So in short, the Puritanism is still not vanished at all. However, the influence of science and philosophy already existed. Okay, Jonathan Edwards, initiator of the Great Awakening, a religious revival that stirred the eastern seacoast for many years, eloquently defended his burning belief in Calvinistic doctrine. Of the concept, Calvinistic doctrine, just a sort of details, is the concept that man, born totally depraved, that could attain virtue and salvation only through God's grace. In his powerful sermons and most notably in the philosophical British Freedom of Will of 1754, he supported his claims by relating them to a complex metaphysical system and by reasoning brilliantly in clear and often beautiful prose. Ayan. So, the wrench of the American Revolution emphasized differences that had been growing between American and British political concepts. As the colonists moved to the belief that rebellion was inevitable, fought the bitter war, and worked to found the new nation's government, they were influenced by a number of very effective political writers such as Samuel Adams and John Dickinson, who are both of whom favored the colonists and loyalists. Joseph Galloway, I'm not that confident with the pronunciation of his surname, Joseph Galloway, but two figures loom above this, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine. However, I will not go further from that. It is just a sort of background. Poetry became a weapon in this American Revolution. with both loyalists and continentals urging their forces on, stating their arguments, celebrating their heroes in verse and song, such as Yankee Doodle, Nathan Hale, and the epilogue, mostly set to popular British melodies and in manner resembling other British poems of the period. During this time also, a body of distinctive American literature began to form. Inspired by the American Revolution, the new kind of literature could only be referred to as extremely nationalist and extremely American. The text, however, were all still written in English style, but the setting, themes, and characters were all American. So the literature written then was like a small window. A small window showing that the world, what it was like to live and to be an American. To be American, sorry. American writers had ventured beyond the Puritan literary style, and its religious themes had developed styles of writing that grew from distinctly American experiences. So the colonial fascination with this scene is the science, nature, freedom, and innovation came through in the writings of the revolutionary period. Okay, next slide please. Okay, that was just a short introduction. Let us now proceed with the discussion, which will be led by Miss Rowena. Thank you so much.
So, the so-called Intolerable Acts of 1774 heightened American discontent and resistance to England. The participation of American colonies in the French and Indian War influenced the American Revolution, which resulted in terrible acts of 1774, it is a reaction to which all colonies except Georgia addressed the Declaration of Rights and Grievances to England in late 1774. The battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775 kicked off the American Revolutionary War, with England sending troops to put down colonial opposition. So when the delegates to the Constitutional Convention met in 1787, they all agreed to the rule of secrecy. No details of the new constitution would be leaked. So, in this constitution, there are two major positions. First is the Federalists, who supported the Constitution as written, favoring a strong central government composed of executive and judicial branches added to the legislative branch. Next is the Anti-Federalists, were leery of the consolidation of power by a federal government headed by a president, arguing that the Constitution replicated a system like the one from which they had just separated. So anti-federalists ultimately influenced the new form of federal government by the addition of the Bill of Rights. Next is the Constitution and the Bill of Rights containing 10 amendments were finally ratified by the last state in 1790. So in this years, the most influential historical event that took place during this period is was the Declaration of American Independence on July 4, 1776, and the American Revolution. Another series of historical events that took place during this time was the anti-slavery movement that began around the turn of the century. Next is the Enlightenment was the major cultural influence in 18th century America. So because of this, the Puritan theology dominated early colonial worldview, gave way to a worldview informed by science and philosophy. During the 17th century, there was an explosion of new scientific innovations, and as a result, the use of reason received greater esteem as seen by the era's other name, the Age of Reason, and human skill was regarded as much more valuable. Next is this new respect for human ability and potentiality lead the period to reimagine the relationship between the individual and the community. So individualism, according to Puritans, was the source of much evil. Individuals and communities were not antagonists for Enlightenment writers, but collaborators who found a balance that benefited both. To put it in another way, individual liberty must coexist with group freedom. Next, this period also illustrates that rationality is not invulnerable to bias. So, women were excluded from the protections of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and were erased by the practice of coverture, which asserted that a woman's legal rights were covered by those of her father or husband. And the concept of Republican motherhood increased access to education for a small group of women, while their rights were still subsumed by white men's priorities. So, though science and philosophy had increased influence in 18th century American culture, religion had not vanished from the scene. Some American intellectuals identified with Enlightenment principles embraced deism, called natural religion in reference to natural law. This belief system, which was more of a philosophy than an organized religion, followed the ideals of empiricism by stating that religious belief should be based on a reason rather than tradition. So deists, um, these people who are member or part of deism, they believe in God because they reason that the orderliness of nature experienced via their senses implied that the existence of a creator. So deists were humanists, adhering to an ethical philosophy that stressed human problems and needs. So a Puritan would judge an action by whether it was in agreement with or against God's will, whereas a humanist deist would judge it by its impact on people. So Unitarianism grew out of the Congregationalist denomination, one of the major denominations of the Puritans. So, Unitarians treasured the Bible as a sacred document. Nonetheless, empiricism encouraged Unitarians to contend that the Bible and religious traditions must be subjected to reason before being accepted or discarded. They disagreed with Calvinist views on human nature's corruption and inevitability of damnation for the majority, believing that all souls were capable of working towards salvation. Next is the Great Awakening, a movement of revitalized piety originating in Europe, arrived in America. So while many of its principles were in direct opposition to Enlightenment themes, the Great Awakening Calvinism exhibited indications of the intellectual movement's influence. It advanced the belief that intellectual understanding of biblical teachings was insufficient. One needed to feel those teachings emotionally, a belief influenced by the humanism. This period saw the establishment of numerous libraries, antenniums, and study groups, all of which were available to those seeking self-improvement. As a result, 18th century American literature is typically designed to instruct. Next, by the time of the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, American writers had ventured beyond the Puritan literary style and its religious themes and had developed styles of writing that grew from distinctly American experiences. The revolutionary period's works reflected the colonists' passion with science, nature, freedom, and invention. In addition, the colonists established their own dialect. Next, during this time, a body of distinctive American literature began to form. The new type of literature, which was inspired by the American Revolution, could only be described as extremely nationalist and extremely American. Although the texts were all written in English, the settings, themes, and characters were all American. Slave narratives, like the book, grew in popularity, and the poetry was also blooming. In comparison to the colonial period, literature grew more inventive. As America's literacy rate rose, so did the number of works published. The publishing sector grew greatly in size as well, making it easier for literary works to go around the globe. Next is, up to the Revolutionary War, the Puritans who had established New England had a significant effect on what was printed in the colonies. Practically every publication dealt with a religious subject. Dramatic performances were also frowned upon by the Puritans. But by the mid-1700s, the Puritan influence was fading. In 1749, the first American acting troupe was established in Philadelphia. 17 years later, America's first permanent playhouse was built in the same city. And in 1767, the South Marketers staged the first play written by a native-born American. Next is, by the mid of 1760s, political writings by colonists were increasingly common and more forceful in nature. So satire, particularly plays, essays, and poetry, was one of the most popular types of political writing. Human vices and folly are mocked through satire. Patriotic poetic phrase were also popular. So patriotic literature emerged in a wide range of styles. Some were cross attempts to persuade the public to support a cause, while others were learned reason, political arguments, and still others were collection of inspirational verse. So okay, to discuss the selection from the revolutionary period and early national period, here is Ariel Mapakpak.
Thank you, Miss Rowena. Theme is revenge and popular because of how it's written, fear of death, murder, and people jumping on things without thinking. Um, the terror of the cask of Amontillado, as in many of Poe's tales, resides in the lack of evidence that accompanies Montresor's claims to Fortunato's thousand injuries and insult. The story features revenge and secret murder as a way to avoid using legal channels for retribution. Law is nowhere on Montresor's or Poe's radar screen, and the enduring horror of the story is the fact of punishment without proof. Montresor uses his subjective experience of Fortunatus insult to name himself judge, jury, and executioner in this tale, which also makes him unreliable narrator. Montresor confesses this story 50 years after its occurrence. Such a significant passage of time between the events and the narration of the events makes the narrative all the more unreliable. Montresor's unreliability overrides the rational consideration of evidence. To its horrific endpoint. And Poe's use of color imagery is central to his questioning of Montresor's motives. His face covered in a black silk mask, Montresor represents not blind justice, but rather its Gothic opposite, biased revenge, and in contrast, Fortunato dons the motley colored costume of the court fool, who gets literally and tragically fooled by Montresor's masked motives. The color schemes here represent the irony of Fortunato's death sentence. Fortunato, Italian for the fortunate one, faces the realization that even the carnival season can be murderously serious. When Tresor chooses the setting of the carnival for its abandonment of social order, while the carnival usually indicates joyful social interaction. When Tresor distorts its merry abandon, turning the carnival on its head. The repeated allusions to the bones of Montresor's family that line the vaults foreshadows the story's descent into the underworld. The two men's underground travels are a metaphor for their trip to hell, because the carnival in the land of the living does not occur as Montresor wants it to. It takes the carnival below ground to the realm of the dead and the satanic. And that's the story and analysis of the story of the Cask of Amontillado. So may I call on Miss Janina Oquendo for her part?
I'm sorry, it's actually Jamino Manaig. So
I'm sorry.
let's proceed with the analysis of the Cask of Colonial. So the cask of Amontillado, if translated into Italian, the cask means barrel and Amontillado means sherry. So, which is a kind of alcohol. So if combined, it forms the title of the Battle of Sherry, which is the Battle of Alcohol. The story abounds in ironies, which is um, like an example, the name of the victim, the story is Fortunato, which means the fortunate one, but is the unfortunate person, and that is the first irony. It is about also the most charitable and gruesome deeds are executed in the carnival atmosphere of gaiety and happiness. Next slide, please. Yeah. So reading the story, it is not actually the scary type. You won't recognize the Hannibal plan of Montresor. It is unlike how their story is. In its plot of narration, Montresor, it has different atmosphere, most likely like that arriving vividly, yet the victim has to be noticed. So in analyzing the way the story is told, it seems like the main character is confessing or telling the story, or it focuses on the first point of view. Um, so the Montresor we are talking about here, despite of being insulted, he is not a low kind or a low class person. He came from an ancient or maybe from a noble family that shows that he is wealthy. And through his plan of Fortunato's brutal execution, it is evident that he possessed intelligence but gifted with the art of cruelty. So, Montesor planned this execution flawlessly, but then you'll come to question what provokes Montresor. In the story, it says that um, Fortunato insulted Montresor that made him plan such scheme of revenge. So if Fortunato really deeply scarred Montresor's fitting or reputation, why is he unaware of the fault he's done to Montresor and to the extent that he accompanies the person he has insulted? Or is it just because he's drunk and he loves wine? Yeah, next slide po. And, um, ayan, in the story, Montesor wickedly smiled at his victim, yet Fortunato thinks it's a friendly smile. So the word that comes out from Montresor's mouth when they met was, "You are luckily met," without Fortunato knowing that he will be entombed alive. So Montresor baited Fortunato, but then even if Montresor is giving a chance to change his victim's mind, he kept on taking the bait. Just like how he said, if Fortunato is busy, Lucchesi, the other wine expert, can take a look. But then Fortunato, being boastful, saying Lucchesi can compare what he drinks, and his and with that, Fortunato is actually taking his way to his grave, and this shows a great execution of plan. Just to clarify, Fortunato is an Italian, um, and if you know, sometimes an Italian loves wine, and he is actually a wine expert. So in general, this story fits well into post dictum that everything in a well-written story must contribute to a total effect. Um, the constant use of irony, the drinking of wine to warm Fortunato and lead him to his death, the irony of Fortunato's name, and the cloth that Montresor is wearing, which is the cape or the kind of cloak that we see when there is death. So now, the next reporter will further explain the analysis of the story, which is Ma'am Alia Pamplona.
Thank you, Miss Manaid. So now let's proceed for the next slide, which is the discovery of gold. It says that it led to one of the biggest migrations that the United States had seen. With this, people started to risk their lives and their families and all of their position. And they are literally drop everything just to rush to California for their chance to just for them to be rich. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This slide is about, it says that trust become an issue in this story. It is because, as you can see, the attached photo, it is meme picture wherein in the upper picture, there is a picture of woman and it has a caption of I don't trust anyone easily, while the lower part has a picture of two men on the right and their driver is a dog. As it's pertaining how men easily just trust, like in the story. Therefore, trust became an issue in this story. It was because Fortunato was insulted and offended by Montesor, who who is his friend. But unfortunately, he still trusted his friend, therefore he accepted to go with him to drink in his house. He was shackled to the wall and buried alive under a wall of bricks after, and then in this scene we can say that Fortunato's misfortune was due to his trust toward his dishonest and vengeful friend. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide it about alcohol. Alcohol represents the control and direction of the story. Here, Montesor offered a drink or the alcohol to Fortunato not because he wants to enjoy it with him, nor because he is a heart rather I mean warm-hearted man, but for the sole purpose of Fortunato's inability to be coherent with the world around him, to unknowingly lead him to his downfall. Next slide. Next is about the horror of being buried alive. Is a fear that nearly everyone has thought about and at one time or another. Poe makes this scene exceedingly long and draws out the elements of fear. He procrastinates the burial of Fortunato by first describing how he is shackled to the wall. This makes the story much more interesting and creates much more suspense for the reader. The word choice and the style of writing, it pulls the reader in and then it also consumes the reader in vivid imaginary and rich detailed description. Next, we'll discuss by Miss Ocampo.
Thank you so much. The Romantic period, which is between 1828 and 1865. Next slide, please. Okay. My short introduction for this, I said that Romantic period is about romanticism and transcendentalism. It is more on the consequences of revolutionary period. Let us know why. Okay, this period is between 1828 and 1860 to 1865. Originated in Europe toward the end of the 18th century and in most areas was at its peak in the approximate period from 1800s to 1840. Okay, Romanticism or the Romantic era or period was an artistic, literary, and intellectual movement that originated in Europe toward the end of the 18th century and in most areas was at its peak in the approximate period from 1800s to 1840. Am I still being heard clearly?
Yes po.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, let us continue. Partly a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, it was also a revolt against aristocratic social and political norms of the age of enlightenment and a reaction against the scientific rationalization of nature. It was embodied most strongly in the visual arts, music, and literature, but had a major impact on historiography geography, education, and the natural sciences. Its effect on politics was considerable and complex. Okay, while for much of the peak, while for much of the peak Romantic period, um, it was associated with the liberalism and radicalism. In the long term, its effect on the growth of nationalism was probably more significant. The work of the Romanticists emphasized emotion, a love of nature, and imagination. The country's unique history and landscape influenced the movement in special ways. The American Romantics were preoccupied with questions of democracy and freedom, which were rooted in the American Revolution that had led to independence from Britain back in 1776. Okay, and America's natural landscape also influenced the writers of this movement in special ways. A lot of the values and ideas associated with American culture, like individualism and democracy, are reflected in American Romantic writing, which played a really important role in spreading those values. So the Romantic movement gave rise to New England transcendentalism, which portrayed a less restrictive relationship between God and the universe. The new philosophy presented the individual with a more personal relationship with God. Transcendentalism and Romanticism appealed to Americans in a similar fashion. Both privilege feeling over reason and individual freedom of expression or over the restraint of tradition and custom. Okay. Romanticism often involved a rapturous response to nature and promised a new blossoming of American culture. For much more deeper discussion for romantic period, okay, let me call Janina.
Thank you so much, Miss Ayasa. So, the American Romantic period. This movement, wait. This movement centered in New England. The American Renaissance was inspired in part by a new focus on humanism, as well as to move Calvinism. Calvinism is the Protestant theological system of John Calvin. The later calling for a movement that would help the American literary style to be unique. Furthermore, the purpose of this movement is to distinguish the difference between American and British literature. The American Renaissance is characterized by a renewed national self-confidence and feeling that the United States was the heir to Greek democracy, Roman law, and Renaissance humanism. During this period, the nationalism was expressed by modernism, technology, and academic classicism. Romanticism became popular in American politics, philosophy, and art. They want to break free from strict religious traditions of the early settlement period. Romantics appealed to Calvinism and Protestant that believes that the destiny of individual is preordered by God. However, Romantic movement gave a less restrictive relationship between God and universe. This will result to new philosophy presented that individual will have a more personal relationship with God without limitation, so that the people will have a privilege with their freedom and expression over restraint, custom, and tradition. Next, please. Okay. So for this one, the Romantic movement gave rise to New England transcendentalism, um, a less restrictive relationship between God and the universe. Through transcendentalism, the American thought and culture will be widely disseminated through the use of prolific print culture like journals and magazines. Romantic movement became popular in America and it influenced romantic writer through writing novels, short stories, and novels because It was so personal and intense, and it portrayed more emotion. The editor owner is typically involved in local party organizations. The newspapers contained of local news, literary columns, and book excerpts for emerging middle class and literate audience. In the early 1800s, newspaper had catered largely to the elite, and politics was the major interest. Next, please. There. Penny press newspapers became popular form of entertainment in mid-19th century. Penny press papers emerged cheap because it is more on advertising rather than high price subscriptions, and to create public broad interest instead to perceive upper class taste. The mass production printing. Lastly, the news gathering and distribution quickly appeared, and one of its purpose is to decentralize the press. The news style was improved in terms of interviews, dialogue, and direct quotation with freshness. Foreign news service reached the highest standard, which is a big achievement. As a result, uh, the year 1840 and 1860 really shows excellence of modern journalism in America. So for the next slide, it will be discussed by Miss Rowena Matangihan.
Subgenre of narrative poetry under study, modern African epic. So, typical characteristics of modern American epic. Typical formal features. It has changed variety, technical, formal innovation, fragmentation, discontinuity, erratic form, lyric, not narrative construction, multiplicity of voice, active role of author, imitative of other epics, voice is direct, informal, frank in tone, colloquial language, reflective and thoughtful, recitation of contemporary cultural markers, specifics of place and time, cherishing the detail of the nation and the world. And typical concerns, it has the thought over action, gives voice to the voiceless, opposes dominant culture, epics of tribes, minorities, focus groups, countercultures, the eccentric self, the regional, marginal, contemplation of important social issues, criticism of war, critical vision of society, focus on persona, focus on movement, focus on sexuality, focus on the future, focus on self, focus on nature, focus on transcendent experience or the idea of eternity, focus on connections or relations, focus on fragmentation or rootlessness, focus on American content like themes, history, and society, focus on contemporary and modern images. Next is the more traditional frameworks associated with epic poetry. First, we have hero, non-traditional hero of the mind, a different kind of epic self. Often the poet, him or herself, a mind heroic in perception, escaping limits, the missing hero, never well defined, thus leaving space for growth and change. The second is journey, internal, personal, or abstract, possibly journeys, not physical ones. By war. So, to discuss the selection from romantic or transcendentalist period, which is the A Song of Myself by Walt Whitman, here is Jemina Manai.
Thank you very much, Miss Buena. So the selection from the Romantic Central period is a song of myself by Walt Whitman. So Walt Whitman wrote an epic poem called Song of Myself. It has 52 sections and some 1,300 lines, which was the first published and titled in the collection Leaves of Grass. In this selection, we will only tackle the sections 1 and 3. So the poem was given its entirety. It got its current name in 1881. The poem, widely regarded as Whitman's most important and well-known work, um, and changed into American verse. It strayed from traditional rhyme, meter, and rhythm, and introduced explicit sexual imagery. Among its distinguished features are an incantatory voice, repetition, and exclamation. There are other passages that are compelling, individual places and actions that move the poets are cataloged in compromising rhythm. Next slide po. Ayun na nga. Just like what I have said, um, and the sections 1 and 2, the next reporter po ang mag-further explain. Section 1, I celebrated myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Next slide po. Section 3, I have heard what the talkers were talking, the talk of the beginning and the end. But I do not talk of the beginning or the end. There was never any more inception than there is now, nor any more youth or age than there is now, and will never be any more imperfection than there is now, nor any more heaven or hell than there is now. Urge and urge and urge, always procreant, urge of the world. May I call on Mr. Ariel Mapakpak for the further explanation. Thank you.
So here, for the analysis of A Song of Myself. A Song of Myself was written by Walt Whitman. It has 52 sections, but in this lesson, we only tackled selection 1 and 3. The poem is to celebrate the human body and its ability to become one with the self and with nature. It focuses on the theme that life is a journey to uncover oneself or one's identity. The speaker shows that the union of the self and the body allows for truly transcendent experience. Whitman appreciated nature and views it positively and believes that he was formed from nature. Next slide, please. Okay, here there are three important themes in the song. First is the idea of the self. It compromises ideas, experiences, psychological states, and spiritual insight. It conceives of a spiritual entity which remains relatively permanent in and through the changing flux of ideas and experiences which constitute its conscious life. And then the second is the identification of the self with other self. So here it emerges with all things and experiences all things, and it will undergo many transformation. So here it shows that the union of the self and the body allows for a truly transcendent experience. And then the third is the poet's relationship with the elements of nature and the universe. The identification of the poet's self with mankind. Here, with this, the poet wishes to maintain the identity of his individual self, and yet he desires to merge it with the universal self, which involves the identification of the poet self with mankind. Next slide, please. Okay, the lines that you have scene is it refers to the poet himself. The poet celebrates the poet's self in the lines above. The line "Sing myself" and "What I assume you shall assume." Also, "Every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you." With this line, the persona intends to continue celebrating himself until his death. Also, he will allow nature to speak without meddling the original energy. And then um, it also give focus to the small personal self, including the physical body. In Song of Myself, it become this is the union of the absolute and relative selves, which is allows the poem personas to express such random amusement in the simple experience of being alive in the flesh, as proclaimed in the poem's first section. Sorry for interruption. And then this is a state of it doesn't require any actions to be fulfilled. Instead, it simply enjoys being what it is. Also, it depicts the person's celebration of bodily pleasures should be understood in this context. And that's all our report. Thank you.
I wish you have learned so much to our report, our discussion. For me, let us compare, no? What is the comparison between the Philippine literature and American literature? Because it's almost the same, no? For me, ako, na-realize ko, I have realized that both Philippine literature and American literature have improved their literary pieces as right after the colonization part, those dark part like that. Like they have both enlightenment part, they have both period where they have promoted o naipakita nila yung kanilang kagalingan ng bawat citizen pagdating sa larangan ng literature. So for those who have finished this video, ayan, meron kayong prize. Makita ang exposure ng pagmumukha dahil ayaw mag-open kami itong mga ite. Okay, sige. Thank you very much po. Thank you very much, Sir Rizal. If you have finished this video, ayan, reward dahil na-finish nitong video na to. Thank you so much. And we have really exerted our effort for this. So I wish, and we wish, that you have learned so much and clearly what we have discussed for today's video. Thank you and see you next class.
Thank you.